Welcome to ODI, where we're going to discuss a new book. This is the book, China's Path to Innovation, and the book is by Professor Xiaolan Fu, who sits here on the right. And so he's a professor of international development and technology at the University of Oxford, and he's also he's founded a whole center, a technology and management center for development. But he's also on the advisory board of the DFID ESG Growth Research Program, DEGRP, which is hosting this meeting. And this book that we're going to launch and discuss is based on a decade of your work, high quality work published in journals, but now combined into one book with an overall narrative. And that's been very, very interesting and important for our research program, which focuses on a number of themes. We've got 4 themes in our program, which is agriculture, we've got financial sector development, but also innovation as a core theme. And Xiaolan has been working on this for a number of years in the program. And we also have a theme called China-Africa. So important of thinking through the effects of China on Africa, but also learning from China. Thinking about innovation in China over the last decade, and there are at least 2 phases of innovation that we hear here. So one is that China's innovation is led by foreign firms. There's an imitation. And yes, there's lots of exports coming from China, but actually the value addition of that export is very low. Think about the iPhone example or some other examples where the value addition in China is very low. That's one sort of stereotype. The other stereotype is that China now is competitive in about everything. Not only is it competitive in garments or electronics, but also in doing research and development. And I hope that Xiaolan will be able to sort of discuss this. And if you read the book, it's a 400-page book, and it's really interesting and an important book. You will get a sense of sort of the stages through which China has gone in terms of its innovation path, and that's where so thinking about what you call a take-off. Initially, sort of after the 70s and 80s, and then a period of catch-up, and then now a period of sort of leapfrogging. And I think that's a very interesting sort of typology to be thinking about and to be discussing. And you have a very good sense of thinking through the role of the foreign and an indigenous sector in driving the innovation in China. And then you come up with this new concept of an open national innovation system. And I think that's really interesting, sort of to think through the importance of innovation and the system that may have been behind it in the case of China, and then to think about what lessons this might have for other countries. I'm, for example, advising at the moment the government of Tanzania for the next 5-year plan. And they're very interested in thinking through their technology plans for the future. Is there something to learn from what China has done over the last few decades? And I'm really interested to hear from Xiaolan on this in a book. And to discuss that, we've got 2 really excellent, also world-famous commentators, discussants. There's Rafi Kaplinsky, who is a professor at Open University and also linked to SPRU and the University of Sussex. And he's also been part, just like Xiaolan, a party of the DFID ESG Growth Research Program. At least he was part of the call when we initiated the call for research about a year and a half ago. And I've been learning over the last decade and a half a lot from Rafi Kaplinsky on global value chains, but also about the linkage between China and Africa. And our other discussant is Deborah Brottingham, and she's also really an expert on China and Africa in particular. And I still remember the meeting that you were leading here at ODI about 5 years ago, where you really shifted the view we had on Africa. At that stage, in the development community, we're thinking about China. In Africa, we're then thinking about Sudan and human rights issues. And while that is still an interesting issue to be exploring, there are lots of other components of the China-Africa relationship that weren't highlighted as much, but which you were highlighting in great detail about all the linkage between foreign firms or Chinese firms in Africa and also the promising avenues that can lead for Africa's development. So we've got really excellent discussions, but of course our star is Professor Xiaolan Fu, and unusually for ODI, we've given her about 25 to 30 minutes to discuss the sort of the main findings in the book, and then I'll ask Rafi and Deborah to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we've got ample time for questions and answers. And I also want to sort of welcome our online viewers who will be able to follow this discussion and from anywhere in the world. And I know that there are sort of people who are also in China looking at this as well. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Xiaolan to discuss your massive book. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Dirk for the kind introduction to ODI and the DFID ESRC Growth Research Program for organizing this book launch event, and also to two highly distinguished scholars, Deborah and Rafi, for kindly agreeing to act as a discussant of my presentation. I really look forward to hear their comments on my research, and also to everyone here and online for attending the event. Actually, I started to work on innovation, the research on innovation around 13 years ago when I was in Cambridge, working on a Cambridge MIT joint project called International Innovation Benchmarking. At that time, I noticed that how important innovation is in national economic policy, in business, and in productive growth, and also competitiveness in this industrialized world. At that time, kind of year 2000, although China has already gone through 2 decades of economic reforms and enjoyed fast economic growth, up to that time, innovation was still a concept that has never come to the center of China's development strategy. Nor has it come to the center of the debate about the drivers of long-term economic growth in China. While, the literature and the empirical evidence has suggested that innovation is one of the crucial drivers for long-term economic growth. However, in the developing world, it has not received the attention that it deserves by that time. So I started to ask whether innovation is an issue for the high-income countries only. And I start to look at the history of the countries, the rest of the countries in the world. Actually, from the year 1960 to now, about 50 years, about 110 middle-income countries. In over these 50 years, only 11 countries has moved from the middle-income countries to the high-income country group. So only, 10, 12 countries moved from the middle-income country to the high-income country group. Who are the countries? I start to look at the countries. There are Israel, there are Ireland, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. Of course, there are other countries like Equatorial Guinea and also Puerto Rico. So, excluding 2 oil resource rich countries, all the other countries shared one common feature. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Israel, Ireland, they all put enormous attention on their innovation capacity in their growing experience. So it appears that also innovation is relevant for the rest developing world, especially for the world, the middle-income countries to move to the high-income countries. So I believed that innovation is an area that's very relevant for the developing countries, for development world, and it should receive the attention that it deserves. That's how I come to this research on innovation in China. And now there is a kind of more widely received consensus that innovation is very important for long-term economic growth. Also for developing countries, especially the middle-income countries. However, the million-dollar question is how? How to innovate? How can the countries, develop its innovation and technological capabilities? The how question is very important, and all the countries, the policymakers, the business managers, and also academics are asking this question. So my research actually focused on the how question. As Dirk has mentioned, each of the chapters of my book is a self-contained research based on firm-level data or industrial level or regional level, even country level, cross-country comparison, compare China to other countries. But today, I spent a lot of time to think what I should present in half an hour. So what I'm going to do is to build upon these individual studies to look back China's path to innovation, looking at the development strategy and the insights from this China's experience, and what can be generalized as a model of developing innovation capabilities in a developing country for them to catch up, and what lessons can be offered to the rest of the world. So I will look at the evolution of China's path to innovation, looking at the roles of foreign and indigenous innovation capacity, contribute to the long debate about the role of technology transfer and indigenous innovation. And also I will look at the national innovation system from this approach. This is a most widely used approach to look at how to build innovation capacity. And then I will look at how countries or regions or industries can really achieve the high performance that they expect. And finally, draw conclusions and implications for the rest of the world. The first is to look at China's path to innovation. Nowadays, China has invested a lot in innovation and also has made amazing achievement. Not only in some high-tech areas like space science, but also China's application for patents. The diagram shows that compared to the rest of the developing countries, the rest of the middle-income countries like India, Brazil, Russia, South Africa, the number of patent application and also number of patents granted to Chinese firms and the researchers are much higher than the rest of the developing world. And looking at innovation performance from exports of high-tech products, exports of high technology products, China also has demonstrated a very strong performance. And this diagram also showed the exports of China's high-tech products to the world has grown very fast, surpassing not only the rest of the developing world, but also Japan, South Korea, etc. So it is one of the major suppliers of high-tech products in the world market. Of course, compare China to the rest of the world, especially the industrialized world, we have to say China performed much stronger than the developing world developing countries, but compared to the leading innovators in the industrialized world, there is a still big gap between China and the world innovation leaders like South Korea, United States, Japan, and some of the leading innovators in Europe. So the gap is still substantial. So for China, the question is still a big question: how to continue to move China from current stage and transform from an imitator to an innovator, a global innovation leader. That's a big question for China too. So the objective of this research, one is to find, the lessons for the rest of the world, also find some lessons and policy implications for China for the way forward. Now look at China's experience, the past. Before the reforms in 1978, China's science and technology system actually is the one following the Soviet Union model, with strong state-run research institutions, and also universities play a lead role. And the reforms of the science and technology sector in China start from 1985. The major changes is that the orientation of science and technology progress changed. First is, from orientating for defense to serve economic growth. That's a big change. We do research to serve economic development of the country, no longer military, defense as the major objective, and changed from central planning to marketization. So put many of the research institutes to the market, and also made it very clear in the national strategy, in the formal documents, that acquisition of foreign technology through imports, through foreign direct investment, as the major tool for foreign technology acquisition. And 10 years later, so at that time is, China try to exchange market for technology. That's a strategy. So 10 years later, in 1995, the government has realized that they need to accelerate China's own science technology capacity. So this comes to the national science technology strategy that they are going to accelerate this. So China's investment in R&D start to take off since 1995. And then again, it's 10 years later, in 2006, in China's national strategy, development strategy, for the first time, they put innovation as a major driver of China's economic development. Before that, it's about system reforms, about investment, about exports, about foreign direct investment. So it's since 2006, innovation come to the very center of China's development strategy. So look at what China has done. First is China has, put great effort in acquiring foreign technology through imports. Although the proportion of imports of technology to GDP remained stable, given that China's GDP has grown exponentially over the past 3 decades, the investment, the expenditure on acquisition of foreign technology through imports has been increasing very fast. So is China's effort in attracting foreign direct investment, especially the inward foreign direct investment into China, and also in recent years is also using outward foreign direct investment to acquire foreign technology more proactively. And another thing that is remarkable is China has started to send young students to study overseas. And this has also accelerated in the past 10 years. And the year when I left my country to study abroad, the debate is about brain drain. People worry about brain drain, and very rare talk about brain gain. And now we started to see, in the past 10 years, the educated students start to go back to China. And this brain circulation and brain gain, this phenomenon has become also a significant phenomenon. And the returnees has contributed to the high-tech startups and also the emerging industries like solar PV, green industries in China. So compared, the openness between China and other middle-income countries like India and Brazil, actually, the level of openness in China is higher than the rest of the developing countries in most of the dimensions. And as I mentioned, also since 1995, Chinese government started to realize they need to accelerate science technological progress. Since 2006, put this into the center of development strategy, and we can see China's investment in R&D is also, the growth is also exponential. Not only compared to China's itself, to the past, the growth is very fast. Also compared to the rest of the countries, the second diagram in the slide, investment in R&D in China also has been growing much faster than most of the industrialized countries in the world. In terms of R&D expenditure, China is the third largest in the world. US, Japan are the top two. And China has surpassed all the rest countries in the world. It's the third largest investor. So looking at China's path to innovation, we can see it combined foreign technology acquisition, especially in the early stage, with indigenous innovation, especially at the later stage. I look at some of the industries using some industry case study. One is the solar PV industry, and also one is optical fiber industry. Clearly, we can see a combination of these two. So it's working using two legs, although at different levels of development, the emphasis on each side is varies. At the early stage, depend more on technology transfer, while they also do indigenous innovation. And the later stage, there are more indigenous innovation, in-house R&D happening in China. Especially the most successful industries, they start to combine R&D, in-house R&D, and technology acquisition much better, and also at early stage. And in terms of the use of foreign technology acquisition, there are different types. One is a more traditional passive type. Imports, receive inward FDI and licensing. And another type is more proactive way. Is I go out to set up R&D lab in foreign countries. I go out to acquire foreign technology using multinationals outward FDI, and also I collaborate with foreign companies. That's the second more unconventional type. So at the early stage, China used more conventional type, and the later stage, when it's more, its own capabilities developed more, they more and more using more unconventional strategy. So is India. So it's India firms, like in the solar PV industry. They show this kind of similar pattern. And also looking at the cross-country, looking at the large firm-level data, I carried several firm-level study, and there are also some lessons from China. First is we found the role of indigenous and the foreign innovation, the importance vary in different industries. In the low-tech, labor-intensive industry, the Chinese firms and the Chinese created technology are more efficient than foreign technology. However, in the high-tech industry, the foreign firms and the foreign technology are more efficient. So there are industry variation. The second is something special in China is the role of university. Universities in China are very actively involved in technology transfer, especially assisting the firms to decipher and to assimilate and diffuse the foreign technology. Foreign technology acquired to China, sometimes too advanced for Chinese firms to assimilate, to decipher, and reverse engineer. So universities work together with firms to help them. So this is a very important stage for creative imitation. So universities actively involved. So I quote, universities in China had a dual role. The third is the role of foreign universities. And what I have found out is Chinese firms also try to collaborate with foreign universities, not only Chinese universities. And the collaboration with foreign universities had a significant impact on the creation of more radical innovation. I think this has important implication for China's transformation from imitator to an innovator, to a global innovation leader. So, doing more in international collaboration. And also, another phenomenon we have observed in China is Chinese firms, although they don't know maybe the concept of open innovation, which is now the world trend in innovation, no longer close innovation in my own laboratory. I collaborate with others globally or nationally to collaborate. This is called open innovation. This concept was brought by a professor in Berkeley. However, in practice, we found Chinese firms already started to do this. And they use this as a response to overcome the resources constraint, capabilities constraint, and also to share the risks. So open innovation has been used as a response to risks and constraints. So based on this, I have been reflecting on how China built up its national innovation system. The traditional literature on the concept of national innovation system, which refers to innovation, is a system engineering. There are three major players: the government, the public sector research institutions, and the universities, and the industry. However, I think what China has done, especially outstanding from the developing countries, is it has very clearly put China's national innovation system in the global context. So open up the national innovation system and make it as an open national innovation system. So how they link the national innovation system to the global innovation system is through trade, through foreign direct investment, through the movement of people, diasporas, and also returnee students, to build up the link. Of course, like in UK or in the world, there are other channels like collaboration. International collaboration is also a very good link to link the national system to the international, and the internet nowadays. I think this also have significant implication for African countries and the low-income countries, where internet now has been, mobile phones has been widely diffused in the society and the economy. So China's experience actually suggests that developing countries can catch up and upgrade through an open national innovation system. And this open national innovation system also try to build up all the linkages, link the national innovation system to the global system through trade, FDI, and people's movement and the internet, and also create linkages within the system domestically, like universities and industry. And also for China is the role of the state, the public and the private partnership, and the role of the state. State more actively involved in the national innovation system. Although we have to be very cautious to assess the impact. That a good side, also the negative side of over-involvement, over-intervention. But they have been very actively to create all the linkages within the system. So that's an open national innovation system which using the dual sources, both internal and external, and also they have used multiple drivers. I think in China, there was some argument about the state capitalism and also arguing about China's innovation is a pure state-led innovation. I think my research has found out is actually in China, the drivers for innovation there are multiple drivers in different sectors and in different regions. The state, the private sector, indigenous private sector, and the multinationals all have a role to play. Like in the high-tech sector, it's the multinationals. In the medium-tech sector, capital-intensive, we can see the state-owned enterprises. The state played a significant role. And in the labor-intensive, low-tech sector, it's the indigenous private firms are very active and driving the frontier shift. And also in different regions. As in the South region, near Hong Kong, Shenzhen, foreign capital, private capital played a significant role near Shanghai. But in North China, in the Central China, we see the state play a more active role in innovation. So the driver is not kind of a single state-led model. It's a multiple driver. That's why China has been so dynamic. And this open national innovation system not only relevant for China, although I derived this from China's experience, looking at the rest of the country, like the newly industrialized countries, South Korea, Japan, and also Taiwan province of China. Actually, although the literature more argue for industrial policy, the strong state in their development, actually the foreign technology transfer also had played an important role. In Japan's technology took off in the 60s and 50s, multinationals like Ford, GE has been very active in Japan, transfer technology, hoping to transfer technology for market. And look at South Korea, foreign technology assistance, and also the returnees, diaspora, coming back from the US, also played a very important role in South Korea's technology took off. Although this was not that much documented. The same as Taiwan. The foreign technology, technical assistance, and the returnees played a significant role, like the Hsinchu Science Park. The returnees came back from the US has been the major force in the development of the electronic sector of the economy. So this is a model I think has wide relevance for the developing countries in their catch-up. So that is one issue about system building. Another issue is you build up this system, you made a lot of investment. However, sometimes a lot of countries, they have not achieved what they deserve or what they expect. Why? There are other factors in play. So in addition to capabilities, there are incentives. How much effort you make to transform your investment into the final output. And also institutions also matter. So in the second part, I look at China's experience from this capabilities approach and looking at the interactions of capabilities, incentives, and institutions. This is a framework actually originally developed by OECD in its 1987 document and later developed by San Jialao. I made an extension of this model. This model argues that the actual performance of an economy actually is determined by its capability, which decides, how fast the best performance you can achieve, and also by incentives, which decides, which guides the use of the capabilities, and all this will be run under the framework of institutions. Institutions set the rule and intervene the whole process. And so is for innovation. The same is for innovation. Innovation capabilities, how much you invest, how much people you have, that's not enough. but also you need incentives to guide its use, and also need the right institutional framework to set the platform and to guide the creation of incentives and the renewal of the capabilities. And look at China, not only China, and also other countries, they invest, and firms, they invest heavily in innovation, but some countries perform very well. Look at innovation efficiency. The US, Japan has done very well, but some countries invest a lot, but their real achievement is only, part of its expectation. China is one of a typical experience. Look at R&D expenditure is high. However, the performance is not that spectacular. The outcome isn't. The incentives in China has not been set in the right direction, sometimes even going to the wrong direction. These incentives is at macro level about economic system, about market, the role of market and the role of the state, whether the market divert the resources to the sectors the most efficient and also most innovative, or they bail out the inefficient firms. And also at the micro level, about your assessment of researchers, of universities, how you assess it. All this human resource and the university appraisal system may divert the researchers and the universities going to the wrong direction or make inefficient use. And also at the same time is about the framework, the institutions, about intellectual property protection, the legal, the industrial side, and also about the skills and the training. All these institutions in China is another area to improve. So looking at this, again, we identify the problems for China in achieving the performance that it expects. And also another issue is the interplay about coordination. The coordination between different ministries, departments of the government is a big issue for China. Of course, it's not unique. The same for other countries too. Each ministries or department protect their own interests. They have their own policies, sometimes contradict with each other. And also need higher degrees of openness. And the problems in China, not only, in this aspect, there are also two important areas has not received enough attention, which needs to be paid more attention, is about the orientation of innovation to more sustainable development, about environmental consequences. The second issue is about the social consequences, about inequality. Innovation, the technical progress is not neutral. It will be biased either towards capital or labor, towards skills or unskilled labor. It has implications for income distribution. Although China's technology created China normally use more unskilled labor. They use more labor than the technology created in Europe or in US. The implication for the inequality among people are less significant, but the implication for regional inequalities is significant. This kind of endogenous process leads to a more widening regional income disparities because richer region can invest more in innovation and enjoy higher growth. So this is about China's experience. So the conclusions from this research, I think, is China's experience suggests that developing countries can upgrade using an open national innovation system. And they can use both indigenous and foreign innovation in efforts and created knowledge. At the same time, although the weights for each of them should change over time, with the changes at different levels of development. And for middle-income countries who want to move out the middle-income trap to a high-income country, to be a high-income country, it needs to, engage in more indigenous innovation and use more proactive, unconventional knowledge sourcing approach rather than more passively receiving inward FDI. They need to use more unconventional sourcing approach. And also China's experience proved there are different roles of the state and the market in the innovation process. It's not a simple market-driven one or nor a simple state-driven one. State and market have their own role, though at different stages of the whole innovation chain. Innovation is a long chain from R&D, highly risky and very costly, to technology product development, to later commercialization, which is much less risky. And the state has much more important role in the early stage, which their market failure is risky and costly, and the market has more role in the later stage commercialization. So at the later stage, the state should leave things to run by the market rather than to intervene. I think China needs to learn about this. Although the support to early stage innovation, to basic science, scientific research, to universities, I think this is important, not only for developing countries, the same for developed countries too. So this is one. And also China's experience also suggests that innovation, the success of innovation and the development of technology capabilities is not only depend on investment and openness. Incentives and the institutions are also very important. And therefore, I suggest a tool, a new policy tool I call the innovation diagnosis, which will bring incentives and the institutions into this assessment framework. Why? Because looking at nowadays, the EU has an innovation scoreboard, has 25 indicators. All those indicators are about capabilities or output. Incentives and institutions are not captured. Even the community innovation survey in the Europe and OECD's innovation indicators, none of them have captured incentives and institutions sufficiently. I think that's something need to really bring into the innovation assessment and the development of the strategy. For China, I will go briefly about China. I think China is moving towards the right direction, although the details for China is the monster. The overall framework nowadays, looking at China's policy strategy, is improving, really moving to the right direction. Looking at the details is how the incentives are set, how the institutions are developed. These details are the monsters for China. Really need to go in depth to examine and to revise and to reform. And the lessons for other countries. First, I think the lessons from China is about the appropriate technology, for different sectors, and also the possibilities for other countries to consider South-South technology transfer. In what sectors the technologies created in the South, in the developing countries, will be more efficient for the other developing countries. The second is about how to participate into global value chain. I guess later my discussions will have also comments on this. And the role of EPZs, export processing zones. China also has export processing zones in Africa. How to make it successful? And China's experience using export processing zone to develop its high-tech industry is not successful. However, in developing its low-tech sector and the labor-intensive sector, that's one of my chapter, proved to be successful. More and more indigenous exports from China. The third is about the orientation to sustainability in developing the innovation strategy. That's China missed in the past 3 decades. I hope other countries can learn from it, and also consider the consequences of innovation for inclusiveness and also the development of inclusive innovation in its strategy. So that's all for my presentation, and thank you very much for your patience.
Okay,
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. And that was a really brilliant presentation, and thank you for sort of placing innovation at the heart of development, economic development, transformation. And you had an impressive array of charts where, particularly in the last 10, 15 years ago, lots is moving up, and where you also point to the importance of openness, and I think you put it at the center of much of this. And in such a way that that you say, well, national innovation systems on its own is not important, openness on its own is not important, but a combination of the two are really important, and I think that's something we need to really discuss. And you also had some very interesting a discussion on the sort of the stages of innovation, and also the lessons that this might have for other countries as well. So we now have two discussants, and the first is Rafi Kaplinski, and I know that you've done a lot of work on innovation as well in China as well, but also on the linkages with other countries, and maybe thinking about sort of the what this could mean for other countries as well. So over to you, Rafi.
Thank you, Dirk. I promised to speak for less than an hour. So, no, I will. I'm very short, and I will really make 2 points. One is about Xiaolan and her book. They're not easily distinguished. And the second one is, what are the big challenges which face us in the innovation realm, and what China's role might be in that area. So it's a great privilege and flattering to be invited to do this. I first met Xiaolan, she probably doesn't remember, as the head of an interview panel in the IDS in 1999, when we didn't appoint her because we thought she was too China-focused, and China wasn't really of wider developmental interest. Can you make a bigger error than that? And we live in a world which isn't always associated with collegiality or cooperation or hard work and integrity. And Xiaolan is I mean, of course you'd expect me to say this, wouldn't you? Xiaolan is really deeply distinctive. And it's a privilege to have worked with you, Xiaolan, and thank you very much. I've learned a great deal from you. We've worked together. I've also learned that, and since I've reviewed some of your work, and you always have to check references in the text with whether they're in the bibliography. I don't know if you turn to the reference list in this book. There are 32 pages of references, and I know you've read them all. I know you've read and absorbed everything. So this is really quite a formidable person and a formidable piece of work, and I'd find those two things difficult to distinguish, and I'm privileged to have worked with you in your journey. The journey is a journey in your book, which is a journey in yourself, Xiaolan. Section 1 is international knowledge transfer and technological takeoff. Xiaolan comes to Britain, looks for jobs. You remember we worked on the EPSRC program in 2001. Then it's around indigenous capabilities and catching up. I think that happened till you took over the job of Sanjay Lal's job at QEH in Oxford. And I think you've really moved us now into a global innovation leader, and not just documenting that in China, but also in your personal life. Insofar as the book's concerned, I have a few minor points. I loved the mix between the micro and the macro, and I loved the qualitative and the quantitative. And often proper economists don't do the qualitative, they don't do the case studies, they only do the quantitative. I would like to have seen more on incremental change in labour process issues and the role of labour in the creation of knowledge and the nature of work in production systems. And also, and I'm going to make some points later on, I would like to have seen more in the book on the adding up story. This is a story about China's accomplishments. But, you know, we sometimes live in a win-lose world. And progress in China is not always progress which is beneficial to the external world. We've spoken about this before. And it would have been quite interesting to have, had you had the time to ask the question, well, good for China, but, you know, at what cost is China's growing share of global markets, which brings us to the African story. But anyway, that's around the book. So those are a few points about Xiaolan and the book of admiration. But since, Dirk, you don't just want me to sit on the stage and look pretty, which is impossible anyway, I thought I'd make some points about the prospective role of China in the future. So China is on the cusp of moving from an extensive path of growth, fueled by amazingly high levels of investment to an intensive part of growth where productivity change, total factor productivity, become very important. And it's not so much the quantum of investment that's important, it's the quality of investment. That's the Chinese transition. It occurs in the context, and this is where I'm going to say something which I have not got very clear ideas about, but we're beginning to work on an exhaustion of an accumulation paradigm globally. We are living at very, very fragile times. We're in the near normal in the north. We have all sorts of structures which have fostered accumulation over the last, some people say 300 years, at least in the post-war era, which are fragmenting, which are fracturing. We have a breakdown of political systems. We have the rise of nationalism. And it's really, really uncertain what's going to happen in the world. So in the context of China's transition from extensive to intensive growth, and in the context of a world which seems to be so uncertain, fractured, and dangerous, I want to just identify 4 areas which might be of interest in thinking about China's intensive growth path. The first one, and they pick up points you've made in your presentation. We've been working recently together on innovation with the Globelix network, so it's not surprising that some of our views overlap. Okay, the first one is much of the incorporation of the developing world in the global economy and growth, particularly in Asia, has been in the context of global value chains. What happens, and in global value chains, standing still is falling backwards. You have to learn to upgrade. That is the necessary component of productive insertion in the global economy. What happens when the lead firms are no longer northern lead firms and they're Chinese lead firms? Is the nature of these global value chains and the role played by lead firms in defining who does what in the chain, what they do, how they upgrade, in what areas they upgrade, will Chinese lead firms in some sense be distinctive? The second one, and you've already pointed to, is the environmental issue. And I think the outside world does not reflect the depth of sincerity of China's attempt to confront the environmental issue, particularly in energy issues and increasingly also in terms of the externalities, the negative externalities of growth. But, we've passed the global carrying, right? We are degrading our physical biosphere. And that has to be the major challenge of our time. And China clearly has a key role to play, and that it's still a middle-income country. If it moves to high-income status, I'm going on too long, okay? You understand my point about what is China's role in this environment. The third one is the one which is my personal interest, which you've pushed to, which is development or growth. What is the nature of the growth which is emerging? And it's a growth path which is highly excluding. Now, it's unsustainable socially, politically, and it's morally unacceptable. And in what ways might the Chinese innovation system help to confront, either as a conscious act or just as a reflective act, these patterns of global exclusion? And one of the points which I thought was underemphasized in this book is the role which markets play in innovation. I'm thinking of Van Hede, you know who I mean, doesn't matter. The role of markets in innovation. And particularly when the growth markets are now in the south and not the north, what are the implications for innovation systems? So that's one inclusion area which I think begins to affect Chinese innovation capabilities. The second one is new ways of thinking about global public goods. And you live in a country which is a middle-income country with a rapidly aging population and a dependency ratio. There clearly will have to be big innovations in social technologies as well also as physical technologies, and China presumably has a role to play in that one as well. So those are all comforting things. The thing which I find most discomforting, forgive me for being impolite, is the rise, and it's not a Chinese phenomenon because we've known for many years that innovation in the North is largely stimulated very often by the state. And the state which stimulates innovation, particularly in the US, but also in the UK, is the military-industrial complex. And so innovation is often has its genesis in the state. Mariana Mazzucato's work you will all be familiar with, and is associated with the military. I have to say I have an uncomfortable feeling about China in the same area. That in the context of the sort of growth of nationalism around the world, the competition in the South China Seas, the geopolitical tensions which are emerging, I have a rather unfortunate sense that the Chinese innovation system is, at least under the surface, significantly influenced by these geopolitical factors. And in a world in which the paradigm fragments and we become more and more uncertain, my worry is that the role, direct and indirect, of the military or the national or the geopolitical, as it were, security issues become increasingly important to China. And I don't think that that's a social good. I think that's a social bad. It's not just a Chinese problem, but I see it emerging rather rapidly in China.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed for your comments. Lots of praise for the scholar Xiaolan, and also a number of authoritative points on where next. Deborah, over to you.
Thank you very much. If I were Xiaolan now, I would want to grab the mic and start responding to Refi's very provocative comments, especially there at the end. But she can't do that because she has to listen to me next. So my perspective is maybe surprisingly quite different from Refi's. I know we've had quite a bit of overlap in our own work, but I'm going to be taking this a little bit more from my training as a political scientist. So let me start out, first of all, by saying this is a brilliant book. And just to see so much work there, it's not often for economists to assemble all of their work together and they're really cutting edge into a book. And so as someone coming from a field that prizes books, we're really happy that you did that. So to put it together so it's all easily accessible and can be disseminated all properly and in one place, that's wonderful. And it is a brilliant book. Now, and the way that you focus so much on the incentives, the institutions, and the capabilities, particularly what you do at the end to focus on how Europe is not doing that. And I can only think about the United States and what we're probably not doing as well. So that's very, very helpful. Now, so I'm going to also be thinking and talking about this based on, I was just in Ethiopia just about 10 days ago. And so a lot of when I was looking at your book and also listening to you this morning, I just got the book last night, so I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing, I have to say, especially because ODI,
It's my fault.
ODI organized a nice dinner for us as well, so that also cut into my reading time. But coming from that, thinking about Ethiopia, about Africa, and how this all reflects there. So the first point, I think, is this, the host government policies and what you talk about in terms of the nature of the state and its ownership of development. It's not purely state-led, but the state does have a really important role. And there's a saying in China about building the nest for the phoenix to come and lay its egg. And there is that whole thing about when we talk about the flying geese model and about firms moving offshore and how they might be bringing new technologies to other parts of the world, we could talk about building the nest for the goose. And so I think this is a really important part about what you talk about and about when I think about the African context. There are very few governments that have that perspective, that they really need to be building the nest for the goose to land in and to start laying its eggs. And I also thought that you had a very good overview of this pressures and attractions for technology transfer. China does have the experience in the earlier days, in particular, of exchanging the market access for technology transfer. And this was this is something in the United States firms complain about all the time, that the Chinese force us to give up our technologies so that we can get access to the markets. And this is also something probably there's some restrictions on this in the WTO. I'm not sure about that, but I think that's a very interesting aspect. One little side note is that we have a new faculty member joining us at SAIS, Johns Hopkins, Ling Chen, and I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but it's very interesting work in China on innovation. And she looks at the differences among municipalities in terms of their fostering of local innovation. And she finds that if they already have a lot of foreign direct investment in their municipality, they don't do a very good job of fostering domestic firms' innovation because it requires taking resources away from that, bolstering the FDI, and they're already getting taxes and other benefits from that, and they would then have to put that into giving subsidies for local firms and fostering innovation there, and so they don't do it. I thought that was an interesting aspect, and you might want to look into her work if you're not familiar with it. The second area that I think this is is so important in looking at what this might mean for Africa and African countries is that you emphasize once again that growth and innovation happen in phases. And it's not as though you just open your markets, or the openness is an important part of it, and then it just happens immediately, and then you're there with the high technology firms coming in and so on. There are stages, there are phases, and it's an evolutionary process. And so for governments in Africa that want to foster this kind of thing, they don't want to necessarily be looking at China today in 2015. They want to be looking at how did China get to where they've gotten, and you've laid all that out very nicely. So I would like to assign your book to all the African leaders who are thinking about how can they learn from China, and I would get them to look at the earlier phases. To the extent that that is still possible, there are lessons to be learned there as well. So, and the idea of university and industry linkages, I thought, is particularly salient, and this is something they can build the groundwork for now. The third point is, I think there's something to be said, particularly from the African context, about the kinds of firms that the country is able to attract, and what this means in terms of technology transfer possibilities. I was thinking in Ethiopia about breaking down the flying geese into different kinds of geese. And so I had some initial idea that there are 4 kinds of geese, and so I'll just lay these out, and they all have different possibilities. There are the geese that come in search of raw materials. And so, and I think about this in Ethiopia because Xiaolan and I have been doing work on the leather sector. So there are geese coming in from China that are trying to access the raw materials that are available there. And the government has used industrial policies in order to foster that. So cotton, leather, but there are other areas, sesame, where there's been no manufacturing investment. They're just coming to access the raw materials and then still going home. So that is one kind of goose, and that's one kind of innovation possibility. A second goose is the one big goose that comes. And in this case in Africa, you could look at Chinese non-ferrous metals company, which has gone to Zambia, and they've actually established the special economic zone there, and they are one company. They have brought in some of their own subsidiaries, but they're one big goose, and it's not really connected at all. It's an enclaved goose. There's a possibility that the famous Chinese shoe company in Ethiopia might be that kind of goose too, unfortunately. It's one big goose, not connected very much to the local environment at all, although it is in the kind of sector where there should be more technology transfer. But so far it's pretty enclaved. There's a third kind of goose, which is the geese that travel together. And that is more the flock that you would imagine. But these geese aren't necessarily linked to global value chains. And so we find companies from provinces like Zhejiang. They come together, they set up often, sometimes in the same kind of industry. They aren't necessarily linked to global value chains. Sometimes they're looking at local markets. And you see this much more in Africa, that they are actually quite a bit in Africa, that they're doing import substitution manufacturing. There are some also that are linked into global value chains, and you find those in southern parts of Africa. They're already in Lesotho and Swaziland and places like that. And then finally, there's the strategic goose that is looking for the markets of tomorrow. And some of the companies like Haier, Huajian, that have set up in South Africa. They're looking for markets of the future. Some of the building materials industries are looking for Africa's construction boom to expand and continue. So there are different kinds of geese with different kinds of technology transfer processes. So the last point that I'll make is on the kind of technology, which is related to the other points. But I think in Africa, there is still the involvement of foreigners in technology transfer. A lot of it still tends to be NGO and donor driven. There's still this idea about bringing in the small scale, the appropriate technology, and there's perhaps less involvement of these kinds of actors in the kinds of, in really linking Africa to the technology frontier that's available for Africa now. And so I think that's unfortunate. Foreign firms need to play a much bigger role in that area. But the donors don't yet have that kind of mentality, or they don't have the same mentality that they had 30, 40 years ago in Taiwan and Korea. And you lay this out, how Robert Wade has also done this very well, about how the aid programs at that point really pulled in the technology, the raw materials, they pulled in and tried to foster domestic capabilities. And they regarded that as really important for the development of those countries. It's not been as big a role in China, of course. But that's pretty much very small in terms of what the donors are doing in Africa. They're really not involved in kind of bringing in the technology and really scanning the manufacturing horizon for what can be done to help bring Africa to the frontier possibilities. So let me say one little point and then I'll stop. And that is, I've just, there's a plug for my new book now. I just finished a book, and the proofs just arrived last night also, which was also a distraction. I've had to see, like, oh, what do they look like? But the book is on Chinese commercial agricultural investment in Africa. And so it's called Will Africa Feed China? But in there, I spent one chapter looking at Chinese commercial agriculture, how the Chinese treated foreign investment in commercial agriculture to move up the value chain in China. And I thought it was very interesting because not very many people studied this. It was hard to even find out. I had to do a lot of little case studies. But there was a really interesting role of bringing in foreign firms in the agribusiness sector in order, and linking with Chinese farmers in order to transfer those technologies to them. So those kinds of possibilities, which are not really what you cover in your book, but those areas are also on the technology possibilities frontier for Africa, and there are a lot of possibilities there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So there are lots of sort of fundamental debates that we've touched on, and I think also the commentators. So the state versus the market in driving innovation, domestic versus international in driving innovation. Different stages, thinking about the staged approach to innovation, and fourthly, I think, sort of thinking through the type of technological change, both in terms of skilled, less skilled, but also in environmental sphere as well. So these are at least 4 debates, but there might well be more comments that come in. What I'd like to do now is to bring in the audience and to give an opportunity for you to ask any questions, also to make points. Make sure that you introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and then sort of trying to be a bit brief in the points that you make and the questions that you have. I'll try to take about 2 or 3, and then I'll go back to Xiaolan, and then you can comment on the points that have just been raised or any of the other points that have come in. Who would like to start first? I think the gentleman over here.